And we're live. Hello, this is the intro for the Darkside. For those of you that watch us back, we know that there are some people who come on and watch us after the live, and we appreciate you from around the world who do that. So we don't know what time and place you watch us from, but we're ever so grateful that you join us. To those that are now logging in and letting us know that you're here, we are so happy to see you this evening. Welcome to the dark side. This evening's topic, as always, is not the most easy, but we enjoy sharing our time with you. Welcome and hello. Any intro you want to do, Mr. Storm?
No, I'm good.
Shocker. Righty, so as always, we love to get your feedback. We love to hear some questions from you. So if you have questions on our topic of the day, please do let us know. If there's something that connects to you, or if there's a topic you want us to look at, please just pop it into the comments box and we should see it. For those of you who are watching from live on Facebook, if you don't activate your comments with StreamYard, then we can't see them, which is unfortunate because I only get to look at them when I go back onto the app after we're finished. So that's just so you know. You need to activate that at the top of the stream page. Okay, without further ado, now that that's done, let us look at today's news stories that we wanted to look at. I have 3 stories for you. I could have picked so many different things this week that happened. It was quite difficult, but there's 3 things that stood out to me. The first story is a news article from the BBC website. They did an investigative piece, I guess you would say, or a review piece of some information that they were looking at out of the United States. And it's a story of a US woman who is jailed for having, or the headline read, US women are being jailed for having miscarriages. And so you can already see that you can ask a question, is this true? Is it sensationalization? But then everything that happens next in the article is really quite frightening. So the first thing they talk about is the case of Britney Pulau, who is a 21-year-old Native American from Oklahoma. She basically goes into hospital for treatment. She had taken drugs. She is arrested and convicted. She's been convicted. She's going to spend 4 years in prison, and it is going to be for the first-degree manslaughter of her son. It is a scary story because she goes into hospital expecting to get help, and then she falls foul of a state law that exists in at least half of all US states, which require healthcare professionals to report to the police pregnant women who are suspected of using drugs. And this concerns me because it is the criminalization of a woman in a crisis situation. There are healthcare issues here. There are psychological issues here. There are addiction issues. And are the police the best place for you to go? In the last 15 years alone, there have been 1,200 cases of women who have been arrested and sentenced to prison for a death to a baby, in the same way first-degree manslaughter for an unborn child. And the majority of those are either drug-related, or, so there's one aspect which is a drug-related incident, or they are women of color. It's actually really quite scary because some of the stories talk about women who've taken a fall and had an accident in that way, or have lost a child in a different kind of way. And I think it's really scary to think that a lot of times miscarriages, we talk about in other countries, aren't handled well. Women aren't allowed to grieve properly. They're not given the care and the time. It can be really traumatizing. It's a loss of a baby, etc., etc. But in this case, at least half the states in America have decided that the way to handle a woman's healthcare crisis and trauma is to say, well, she should be arrested for first-degree manslaughter. I can't wrap my head around it. It should probably be a topic in and of itself. I don't really have. It beggars belief. I find it quite shocking, to say the least. Is there still anything to add to that?
Nope.
No, it's too much. Even for him. I think for me, it's something that maybe we need to spend some time looking at, because it's shocking to see the mishandling of a healthcare issue in such a negligent. I mean, it's not even. It's more than that. Anyway, moving on then to news story number 2. Many of you would have heard this week that F.W. de Klerk, the former president of South Africa and the last president to preside over apartheid, died. He was in power from 1989 to 1994, and he shared a Nobel Peace Prize with Mandela for his part in negotiating an end to apartheid. He had a final message that he recorded that was delivered after his death, in which he explicitly apologized for the, I think he said, hurt, harm, and damage caused during the apartheid era. He retired in 1997 from politics. He is by no mean a figure without controversy. He was a staunch believer in apartheid before he came to power, and when he came to power, it came as a surprise to everyone, the shift that took place with him saying that South Africa should not be a place of, or should be a place of anti-racism, not racism. It's quite interesting that, of course, whenever someone of that magnitude, a president, dies, you know, you can have a lot of feelings. And there was a prime minister in the UK who died a couple of years ago, who people had very strong feelings towards, and it stirred up quite a lot of either out and out, just we're glad she's gone, or people reminding us to be mindful of the fact that death is not something to gloat about. So it's quite interesting to see that. But I bring up the case of F.W. de Klerk because I think there are no clear-cut, easy paths in life. And his case definitely shows that the negotiation process is fraught with problems. And in recent years, there have been accusations that he and other apartheid leaders really needed to stand trial for that negotiation at the end, which I found quite interesting. They were saying that basically at the end of apartheid, he and others in the country ordered death squads to go in and do the final closing acts of damage to the South African people, and that they were not held accountable for those actions. It was as if it was either apartheid or negotiating democracy and an end to apartheid, but that in that negotiation, it was ignored the level of damage that was done. And so those are ongoing conversations for the South African people to have, not for me to have. Obviously, as an outsider, it's very difficult to be a party to that conversation. But I think it's a good reminder that sometimes in our most difficult points, when we're trying to do what seems like right and negotiating our way out of a position that we are obviously wrong in, we can still do harm. And that, I guess, is something that all of us should consider. But yeah, Mr. Storm, do you have something to say on Mr. de Klerk's passing?
Oh, I think he knew the writing was on the wall. And it was a question of how best to butter his bread once he left power.
Those are painful conversations to have, but are you changing because you're convicted in your heart, or are you changing because of an external force enforcing that upon you? And whichever of those it is will determine your actions, basically. All right, so we have our final news story, which is in European news. You know, I like to keep it European just to remind the rest of the world that we exist. In European news, the corona lockdowns are back. Controversially, across Europe, there are discussions to slow down the spread of corona. That is, it has been met with some very unusual responses. We've been doing this for 2 years now. You think people would realize that the deaths of loved ones, friends, sisters, parents, grandparents has not been easy for people. And yet still, for example, in the Netherlands, there were 200 people who were out or were challenged in the protest. There were more people, but there were 200 people that were challenged in their protest, 5 of which were arrested. There were clashes with police. It was met with fireworks being thrown at the police and all sorts of violence in The Hague, in Den Haag. So it's been interesting to watch in some ways that after 2 years of a change, a world change, like it's, how is it that there are still some people that for them the sting and the pain and the change is still so unacceptable that they will resist everything in order to protect their own selfish interests? For me, that's how it looks. But maybe, Mr. Storm, you can give us a different side to that.
Look, for me, I just look at what's happening, and it's evolution at its finest.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, we're going to segue into our next point, which is our main discussion topic for this evening, which is food insecurity and poverty. I've been wanting to tackle this subject for a while because the language surrounding food insecurity is steeped in capitalist, racist tropes and ideologies. And I think that until we rid ourselves of that, we will constantly be battling the same issue and getting nowhere, in my opinion. So I know there was a news story in the UK, Mr. Storm, forgive me, about a head teacher, is that right, who declared...
Yes. There was a headmaster in Wales who said that any children who owed any money would not be receiving meals from the school. And it didn't really matter how much child could have owed a penny or a cent, depending on which country you live in, to give you some context, and the child wouldn't be receiving any food because they owed a penny or a cent. So yeah, there's a lot of issues going on within that, which I think just feed into just how many children are living within food insecurity in a nation that's supposed to be prosperous like the UK.
Yeah. And I think that that's something that, having now done the work to look at this topic, food insecurity, hunger, and what's the final one? Food insecurity, hunger, and malnutrition. Those are the 3 that they put together. Account across the world, including nations like the USA, for either 1 in 9 or 1 in 10 people. And in the USA, I found that statistic in some ways quite shocking, but also just, yeah, that makes sense to me. It made sense in some ways. And it's 1 in 9. I was like, yeah, it sounds about right from what I know about your country.
Before we go any further,
yes.
I just want to play a game with you.
Oh, okay, cool. Games are good. Let's do it.
Right. So I'm going to give you a country and a statistic, and I'm going to tell you the next one, and I want you to tell me whether it was higher or lower. Sorry.
Than the country before.
Yes.
Okay. Come on. I can do this. I can get it right.
So this is about food security levels.
Okay.
Okay. So let's go with Algeria, 27%.
Have security or insecurity?
Are in food insecurity. Okay, so
Or
that's the first
insecurity.
country. So now
All right.
I'm gonna give you the next country, and you're gonna tell me whether it's higher or lower.
Okay.
Okay. So Algeria, 27%.
Okay.
Morocco,
Lower.
trick question. It's the same. It's 27% in Morocco as well. Okay, so let's go with Saudi Arabia.
Ooh. I'm gonna say lower.
Yes, you're correct. It's 12%.
Okay. Okay. Good. Yeah. Right.
Okay. Let's go China.
Higher.
Yes, 22%. Let's go to Norway.
Lower.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're good at this. It's 5%. Okay. Uh, let's go to Germany.
Ooh. Higher or lower than 5%? I think it's higher than 5%.
Uh-uh.
Oh, really?
Germany is 4%.
Oh, come on now, Germany. Well done. Yay, that's land.
Okay, let's try the Netherlands.
Higher.
It is, but not
Yeah.
by much. It's at
Okay.
5%.
Okay. 5%. All right.
Okay. Let's go with Japan.
I want to say lower, but I feel like it's higher. I don't know what to do. People help me. Is it lower or is it higher? Japan, is that lower than 5% or higher than 5%? Higher?
That's your final answer?
Yeah, I'm just gonna go with it.
It's actually lower. It's at 4%. Okay.
Which I see how you're getting me on these small margins now.
Mhm. Let's go with then Russia.
Higher.
Yes, it's at 11%.
Yep.
And the USA.
Is that the same? Is that an option?
It is an option.
Higher.
It's actually the same.
Is it the same? Oh no! You see?
And I've got more, but I'll just do one last one. No, maybe I'll do a couple more. Romania.
Higher.
Lower.
Okay. So let's just hear that out loud. So like the food insecurity level in Romania is lower than the USA and Russia. That's
Right?
insane.
It's 10%.
Wow.
And Hungary.
Lower?
Yes, it's at 7%.
I'm trying to think of my friends and then gauge it based on the knowledge I have of the friends I know. It's really good. I have quite a good working friendship around the globe. Yeah, that's really quite frightening. It's really quite scary, to be honest, I think. But let's do some definitions of terms. I think that's probably important. So there are three terms that we've used thus far: food insecurity. I've talked about hunger, and I've talked also about malnutrition. And depending on how you count those definitions will depend on your numbers of people that are in dire need, so to speak. That's it. From what I can tell, it depends. I think all three of those things are really bad, but let's talk about food insecurity first, which is a lack of consistent access to enough food for an active, healthy life. So there's an inconsistency. Food insecurity is a lack of available financial resources for the level of food for a household, and it does not exist in isolation. Families that experience it also experience challenges with housing, social isolation, chronic and acute health problems, high medical costs, low wages, and all sorts of other things. So food insecurity is linked to a range of challenges that an individual can be going onto. Hunger, however, is the feeling or physical sensation of a person of going without food. So they're really trying to look at it in, I guess the difference is that hunger and food insecurity are looking at two different systemic issues. If for example children are going hungry and they're beginning to have all of the symptoms of hunger, and so they begin to, I forgot the word I'm looking for, I don't know that I've written it down, where their bodies start to change as a result of the hunger. Let's say that when their physicality starts to have real huge changes, that doesn't necessarily address the systemic issues that are causing that food insecurity that is the underlying problem. So if we talk about hunger, you might come at it from a perspective of we just need to give them enough food every single time, like they need to have enough meals. But what you're not coming from is a perspective of looking at the systemic issues in a community, family, or network in which the people are living and experiencing the either or challenges that may occur. So, for example, do I put food in my child's mouth versus electricity to light the house? Do we have water to drink in some places versus do we eat? And those challenges, if not systemically handled in the food insecurity questions, can lead to challenges. And then the final one is of malnourishment, which means that you are getting food, but it is not nourishing and it is not fulfilling the same purpose to fuel you for a healthy lifestyle. So what you have access to, whatever food that is not nourishing food. It might sustain you for a period of time, and as a result you might have a shorter lifespan, you might die at a younger age, it can cut down the life cycle, but it is not, the food quality itself is of such a level that it cuts down. So for example, well, people talk about kind of basic meals that you may have in certain non-Western nations. But in a Western nation, in a poor setting, it may be that the only thing they have access to and are using, for example, in the USA was one of the examples, is, fizzy pop is what the children are drinking, and biscuits and crisps and heavily processed food, which gives not only no nourishment, but is malnourishing the child, but is leading to a battery of health issues. And dealing with it from a hunger perspective, where you say, oh, well, then the children need to be given fruits and vegetables, is not actually dealing with it or saying that those items should be more heavily taxed, isn't actually dealing with the fact that the child doesn't have access to fruits and vegetables. And why doesn't the child have access to fruit and vegetables? And that was a really big point of learning for me about the malnourishment, especially in Western countries, is that there's a conversation happening around, well, children are obese, the obesity rates are increasing, poor families are struggling, and therefore they're eating the wrong kind, so we need to tax the wrong kind of food, without asking a fundamental underlying question, which is, why is it cheaper to buy a blueberry muffin than the same equivalent of blueberries? Why is that cheaper, and why is it that the people in those communities don't have access to the raw materials or a way to sustain themselves with the raw materials? So that was the three terms.
Right. Well, just on the food tax aspect that you brought up, the little question of that, here's the thing. Introducing a food tax like that only increases food insecurity.
Right.
Right? Because all it will do is ensure that poor people have to pay more for the foods that they can afford,
Hmm.
because if you're taxing the foods that they can afford, but you're not making the healthier foods cheaper at the same time. The
Right,
cost of that isn't coming down. So
right,
all you're doing is ensuring that the unhealthy foods
right,
that they buy are more expensive.
right.
And if you introduce a tax to the point where the unhealthy foods are more than the fresh foods, you're just simply driving people into greater poverty,
Right, absolutely.
right?
The
So a
reason they
food
couldn't afford the healthy food was because it was out, they were outpriced on it. And now to turn around and drive the price of the unhealthy food, so to speak, up to the level of the healthy food is only just meaning that people are eating even less, let alone they don't have the option of even making healthy choices isn't an option. I'm just trying to get whatever bargain I can so I can put food, something sustenance in my belly. I'm not even trying to get, because I can't afford it, which means I have to eat less food than I was eating before.
right. So I just wanted to bring up that point because I was gonna bring it up later, but,
Yeah, I think it's a
since
really good point to make sure that we don't miss.
I
All
just
right,
wanted
so there is a couple of things that I want to bring up here. Just two things that I've got on my list of things that I want to bring up, which is that the first thing is the conditions that people are born into, live, learn, work, play, worship, and the age that they are affect a wide range of health, functioning, quality of life, outcomes, and risks. So the fact that since the pandemic, it's estimated that an extra 161 million people have gone into food insecurity around the world is not an accident. It's not a, you know, yes, there have been some people that have experienced a time where they can manage, but there are 161 million minimum who it's believed have gone into food insecurity because if your working environment, if your living environment was already under pressure, any world event, any nationalized event is going to push you further towards malnutrition and food insecurity. It's going to push you further down that system. So I think what I really want to drum home to people is that this isn't a question about somebody making a poor choice and they should just eat better food or they should make better choices. This is about looking at the systemic issues that surround food insecurity and why do those issues exist. And I'm sure you want to get to some of those things. One of the things that I found quite interesting, this is the last thing that I've got on my list, which is that the UN have a zero hunger by 2030 goal. And it's said that the pandemic has set them so far back, it's almost impossible for them to meet this goal. And so already, we're 9 years out now, but it was 10 years when the original report was written. And every year it's adding at least 10 million people going into the hunger category. So you've had the food insecurity category widening and also the hunger category widening. So this idea of getting to zero hunger by 2030 is seeming further and further away. So they have 17 sustainable developmental goals to end hunger and achieve food security and improve nutrition. So I wanted to talk about some of these because I think they're quite interesting. But I'm just going to give them to you so you can see some of the challenges that we're dealing with. They wanted to end hunger and ensure access by all people to safe and nutritious food. That provides challenges across the globe when some countries, USA, approve things for people to eat that are clearly not nutritious, and those things are banned in other countries. Chlorine chicken, for example, stuff like this. Ending all forms of malnutrition. I find that quite an interesting goal, but what they're trying to do is doubling the agriculture productivity and incomes of small scale food producers. So if you're not a large scale, they want to increase, small scale people who are doing their for their local community maybe, or it's a small scale garden. They're trying to double the size of what they're doing. They're ensuring that there are sustainable food production systems, increasing investment in agriculture, correcting, and this one really got me, correcting and preventing trade restrictions and distortions in world agricultural markets. That's, to me, where the rubber meets the road, because there is quite a disparity around the world between what is allowed in one country and what is not allowed in another country, and who determines that is, for me, quite scary. Adopting measures to ensure the proper functioning of food commodity markets. There is this consistent story that I hear that says there's just not enough food to feed the billions of people on Earth. On the other hand, there is a story that we hear as consistently about the level of food waste in Western countries that would feed entire nations, if not continents, around the world. So which one is it? We're either not producing enough food, or, to me, you're wasting so much food and you're controlling the markets in such a way that it's detrimental to smaller nations. So I think the final thing to say is that there are 2 billion people who don't have access. This was the data from 2019. 2 billion people who don't have access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food. That's insane.
Yep.
So how do you want to take this topic? Because there was lots of things that stood out to me. One of which being that they talk about the majority of people half of the people who are experiencing food insecurity live in Asia, and a third live in the African continent. From a perspective of growing up in the UK and watching adverts and listening to drives and charities, you would have thought, in my opinion, that the majority of people live in Africa, and that we should have, in the few decades that I've been alive, we should have touched that. But it's not the case. It is actually not Africa that has the most, but Africa today has the fastest growing population of people going into food insecurity. And I have to question, what have all these organizations that have been operating for decades been doing that a place with a smaller population of people that we all have been supporting, that we've all been kind of paying into these charities, what are you guys doing on the ground? Like, what is this? What is happening? How is this allowed to happen? I question. I got questions.
What's that?
So were you trying to share something with us?
No, something. Yeah. Anyway, so to get on with the subject, in the UK, there was a National Food and Strategy Review that was done earlier in 2021, carried out by Henry Dimbleby. And his findings of the food system in the UK was that it provided convenient, affordable food and drink to support a growing population, but that the process was unsustainable and the food produced is injuring health and the environment. Okay. What he said was that they were producing too much food. If you're producing too much food, then please explain to me why people are going hungry.
It's insane.
Right. So we'll come back to that question, because I think that question goes to the fundamental principles behind food insecurity. Okay. There's an organization called the Health Foundation, and they have a podcast. And in it, there's a podcast from earlier, just a couple of months ago, August of 2021. And in it, they say that 2/3 of adults in the UK are obese. 1 in 10 children start primary school obese.
Whoa.
By the end of primary school, that number has doubled.
Whoa. That's insane.
Okay, so you're talking about 20% of your children that are leaving primary school
Wow.
are obese.
Whoa. That's a lot.
Okay. Um, Pre-COVID,
Hmm.
now I want to say this, that because of the difference of definitions for food insecurity, statistics are going to vary uh,
Vastly.
from source to source.
Yeah.
So all the statistics that I used playing the game came from one source.
Right.
Okay, so that was to provide that was to provide an accurate comparison. They would have consistent factors for
Hmm.
deciding what
Yeah.
was what. So pre-COVID,
Hmm.
there was a survey done called Food and You. It was done in 2018,
Yep.
in which 10% of households in the UK reported moderate to severe food insecurity. And
Mm.
by that, that means that in any 6-month period, they would have to skip meals or cut
Hmm.
back on the amount of food they were eating due to a lack of money,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
In real terms, in real numbers, that
Hmm.
equates to 2.3 million children,
Whoa. It's a
right?
lot of children.
That's a lot of children. So when we come back now to this headmaster, which is a news story that we started
Hmm.
with,
Hmm.
post COVID,
Hmm. Hmm.
talking about depriving children of meals, I think we should be aware of how much worse that picture has gotten
Mm.
and just the
Mm.
level of ignorance at best,
Hmm.
at worst callousness,
Mm.
to say to children, your parents have not paid your food bill,
Hmm.
you will starve.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because for some children, this is the only meal they're getting,
Hmm. Yep.
right?
Yep.
So what they what this podcast does, one of the people that was on the podcast was like the chief advisor or one of the chief advisors to Henry Dimbleby, who wrote the report that I mentioned before.
Hmm. Hmm.
And what she says is that the households that are living in food insecurity are faced with having to prioritize food that is filling and does not go to waste over food that is fresh and nutritious.
Hmm.
Because, of course, you have to, if you don't have much resources, if you don't have much money, you have to buy food when you can afford it and
Hmm.
something that is going to last,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? So, tin goods are, you're going to buy dry goods, you're going to buy fresh
Hmm.
goods, they don't last long. So, yeah.
Yeah.
What he also pointed out, and this is an interesting statistic, um, is that unhealthy foods,
Hmm.
calorie for calorie, are 3 times cheaper than healthy foods.
What?
Yeah.
That's insane. I mean, we know that. Like, I know that when I go into the store, we have
Mm,
kids who eat a lot of fruits. And so when we go to the store, I recognize that a packet of biscuits costs €1 versus the favorite fruit, which costs €3 or €4. And from the favorite fruit, that will last one sitting, and the biscuit packet is going to last 2 weeks, 3 weeks. It's not going to be gobbled up in one go. It's got some longevity in it. So I know that. I cognitively know that. But when you say it in a way of calories and 3 times, it feels as if there's a game being played on me, the consumer. Like the raw goods that go into making these products, because there's flour, there's eggs, there's milk, these raw goods are more expensive than buying the process of which they have to use that to make that. So how come I can't get that? Like, how come I can't afford the basic product? It's
right. So what then happens is these people who are struggling to afford fresh foods then end up with health problems. So when you're talking about obesity, we're talking about people a lot of the time that have poor diets, and a lot of the time the poor diet, not always, but there is a vast percentage, is because they can't afford the healthier meals.
Yeah.
Right? So you have obesity, high blood pressure, all of these things that are,
diabetes, so on and
yep,
so
right? And I think what they're talking about when you look at the statistics and the figures for the impact of and the amount of deaths that this causes
Mm.
is higher than COVID, but it's not receiving the same attention as COVID. And I think we need to recognize the crisis that food insecurity is and is causing, and the damaging impact on health, and the fact that it is killing people.
And that, I think, to add to that, the options that are frequently discussed, and maybe some of our viewers will be able to reread news stories in a different way. The way that things are reported is that obese people need to make better choices. We need to empower people to make a good choice. We need to give people options to make good life choices. They're not making good. Poor people don't manage their money well. Poor people are doing, these really negative stereotypes about poverty that in reality, when you look at the systemic nature of poverty and what goes into the behind the scenes aspect, if so to speak, of what goes into making it difficult for the person who's in that situation, you can't help but say, if we didn't systemically have a flawed system in which you can equally produce too much food for your country and at the same time have people who are so food insecure that it's cutting their life expectancy, and causing them health complaints and issues, how are those two things allowed to continue and be sustainable? And how is that even the right way to run your society, that people could just go hungry and that's okay?
Right. So two things. Poor people are better than rich people at managing money. Right? There was that MP a little while back in the UK who said that they were talking about the MP's wages and expenses, and he said something like £1,000 is not much to live on a month. When you have people who are on benefits living on less than £100 a week.
Listen, right? You saw me tilt my head because now we're gonna get into an area where I'm like, is this man insane? There are people who are working full-time jobs and whose minimum wage ain't touching £1,000 a month, and they are having to manage to stay alive and feed themselves and any other person in their life.
Right. So, and that I believe the £1,000 or whatever was just, he was talking about the expenses. So we're not talking about wages; we're talking about his expenses.
Yeah.
So, look, here's the reality: you give a poor person £100 and tell them that's all they have till the end of the month, they're going to make it through to the end of the month. You give a rich person £100, and chances are they're going to struggle to make it to the end of the month.
Well, you see that anecdotally in shows like where the boss becomes one of the workers. What's that show called? Undercover Boss.
Undercover Boss, yeah.
Right? You see that every single time on Undercover Boss because they go and they live in the accommodation and they have the budget of, and you see them struggling to survive mentally sound for only, what is it, 2 weeks a month in that within the limits of what their workers are expected to do. And yet what I stands out to me from Undercover Boss, whichever country it is in, USA, UK, it's like the overwhelming joy and optimism of the person who actually has to do it for their own life versus the defeatism of the manager who's like, this just can't work. There's no, this is not possible. I have to do something to change, knowing that they have the power to do that, is quite spectacular. It's quite a difference.
Right. And so you just brought up the next point. So far we've talked about the physical effects of food poverty, but we haven't spoken about the mental effects of food poverty. And that often people living in poverty, and in the UK in particular, well, even in the US, I know, a lot of people that are going to food banks are working.
Yes. Yes.
Right? So you're now dealing with the fact that these people are working and they're tired.
Yes.
And they're fatigued. And
Yes.
especially when you have children,
Yes.
they're coming home and they're emotionally, physically worn out. And so their response is, how do I feed my children in the quickest time possible? Because they don't have the energy and the mental capacity to be dealing with it. And of course, this then means cheap processed meals.
Yep.
Right. So I think that's another thing that we need to be mindful of. So that's just that. So the causes of food insecurity can vary from country to country. It can be impacted, or food security can be brought on or impacted by war or drought. But the overriding factor that causes food insecurity is poverty. Right. And so that comes back to the question I asked earlier. How is it that a national report for your country can determine that you are producing too much food, and yet you are still living in a country with 10% of the population in food insecurity? And that is because of poverty. And that is because of inequality. So there's an article in the Journal of Sustainable Agriculture. It was written in 2012, and it is entitled, "We Already Grow Enough Food for 10 billion people and Still Can't End Hunger." Right?
Because the world's
Now,
population is not at 10 billion, right? It's at
no,
7?
it's predicted to reach a peak
Reach 10, yeah.
of 10 billion in 2050, I think it is.
Yeah, that's right.
And what this article is saying is that, wait, that we already produce enough food to feed that 10 billion.
Yeah, that's right.
Why do we still have hunger?
Right, absolutely, 100%.
And I'm going to quote from the article. It says, "Hunger is caused by poverty and inequality, not scarcity. For the past 2 decades, food production has increased faster than the rate of global population growth."
I feel like you should say that again for those people who are watching this and, really don't get this point. and have listened to the scaremongering about population is too big and the world's earth can't sustain itself and there's not enough food to go around, articles that are written in this journal say that food insecurity and poverty isn't caused by scarcity, it's caused by poverty, and that's the difference. There's a real big difference in that.
Right. Now, this is there's that to take in mind, or to bear in mind. But when you combine this with what I'm about to tell you next, it's going to
leave the show.
Quite possibly. So, the majority of industrially produced grain, industrially produced grain goes to biofuel or to cattle. It's used for animal feed. So I want you to just bear this in mind, right? We grow more food to feed animals that will in turn become food than we do for people who are hungry.
The reason for my silence, people, I think you need to understand the reason for my silence. The reason for my silence is that the artificial nature of the food industry and the way that it has been promoted makes me stop and be silent when you hear that we will produce more food to feed cattle that we're going to eat eventually than we would allow that grain or grow grain full stop to feed people, knowing that we're just coming off COP26, environmental issues surrounding the production of meat, the destruction of forests to produce some of this grain are causing damage to the planet. And instead of switching that round and saying when the store has no meat, it has no meat, like, it ain't got no meat, it got no meat. Like, if we run out of eating burgers, no problem, there are other foods that you can eat that aren't meat. Like, this idea that meat, like, for me it's really difficult because I can see all the different narratives, and in the end it feels like all of those narratives are building to a place where it's poor people who are being blamed or being scapegoated or are being made to suffer higher than they would because they're poor, because of greed, profit margins, capitalist ideologies. It's really difficult to see all those narratives line up side by side and then say, yeah, we'll continue blaming poor people for the problems of the world. That's what we'll do. They're clearly the issue. It's clearly them that's causing the problem. No, it's not. It's clearly not. There's something wrong in our thinking and the way that we're being socialized to believe that. Anyway, go on before I take over on a little run.
Yeah. What was I saying? I don't know. Anyway, yeah, so we're growing more for animals than for humans. So there's another article that I read in a journal called Science, and it's entitled Food Security: The Challenge of Feeding 9 Billion People. And what it does, it cites that 30 to 40% of all food grown and produced is wasted. So to put that into perspective, that's enough food wasted to feed everybody that is in food insecurity. So the concept or the idea that there is not enough food
Mm,
in existence
mm,
to feed everybody is not true.
mm,
Now, there are various reasons for this food being wasted. And what the article does is it talks about um, the food distribution systems being inefficient.
mm,
Okay. Um, and what it says is that climate change is only going to make these matters worse.
mhm,
So, for example, India loses 30 to 40% of its produce, of its fresh
mhm,
produce,
mhm.
as retailers and wholesalers lack cold storage,
Wow.
right? So that's a lot of food waste within the
Wow.
country. And
Yeah.
the number of people in India living in poverty,
It's high.
when you take that out, is high. And of
Mhm,
course, if that food wasn't wasted, it brings the cost of food down.
mhm, mhm, mhm,
Right? I mean, it's extortionately high as it is, but it will bring the cost of that down even further.
mhm,
But what the article goes on to say is that in developed countries, the cheaper the food, because food is
mhm.
cheaper, it reduces the incentives to not waste the food.
Mm, 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 mm.
So retailers and wholesalers just write it off.
Right.
Um, in the UK, you get damaged goods in the store,
Mhm, mhm.
they just write it off to expense. They don't give it away
No,
because if you
this is
gave it away, you couldn't write it off as in your loss column.
yeah,
You
and
know,
this is actually a campaign that's been going on for some time now to change the way that, or to change the laws and to change how we can list these things to reduce food waste of restaurants and supermarkets and cafes, etc.
look,
And it doesn't even seem like it's really scratching the surface of the problem.
right. So, well, I mean, you're talking about cafes and restaurants. Yes, that's an issue. But Nadia Hussein last night, I was
Mm-hmm.
watching a program.
I was going to bring
Yeah,
this up. Yep.
actually, the majority of food waste is not on an industrial level. It's
On a
actually
household
in
level.
the home. It's on the household level.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's a matter of people being more selective in what they buy and not
Mm-hmm.
buying so much so that it doesn't go to waste. Because of course, if you stop buying so much and wasting so much, it builds up. Surplus builds up. It drives down the cost of food, or it should do. Yeah, I know. It should do in theory if capitalism really worked,
Right.
but it
But it doesn't.
doesn't. Um, and so I think that's to bear in mind. Um, what was I saying? Oh, I've forgotten what I was saying now. Um, but yeah, so there are different reasons for
Mm-hmm.
why food wastage is so high,
Mm-hmm.
but it is not things that cannot be overcome.
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted to help out, or if richer countries wanted to help out, what they could do in India, for example, is actually subsidize or send cold storage units so to retailers, to wholesalers to bring down the cost of food so that you
Right.
can store it for longer for
Right.
all of these things for the fresh
Right.
produce.
Right.
Um, I think there's other things to bear in mind. So there was a rumor that the US government was paying its farmers to destroy crops.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. To the best of my knowledge, that is rumor.
Okay.
Okay. They
Mm-hmm.
don't pay farmers to destroy crops. What they do is they pay farmers to let the land go fallow.
Right. Okay.
So
Okay.
you have the ability to produce even more food. Now, bear in mind, if you're
Mm-hmm.
going to say food is expensive because we don't have enough of it,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
despite
Then
the
the
fact
answer would be
they
produce
produce
more,
more. The
and then
answer
the
is going to
price
be
goes down.
produce more and
Mhm,
decrease prices.
mhm,
But
mhm.
actually, it's more beneficial for the US economy for the government to pay farmers not to increase
Production,
production, and they will pay them not to increase production. So,
which is against, let's be honest, a UN. This was in the UN Sustainable Development of Food. This is one of their goals, is to increase agricultural food production, not to
right,
just increase food, but
yes,
nutritious food. So if
right.
your country is doing the opposite,
But what the UN was talking about was actually doing it for the smaller landholders.
mhm, mhm,
Um, and actually, the small landholders actually produce more than the industrial.
yep,
But
yep,
there are different factors that make that system inefficient.
right, yep,
Okay. And some of that is once again poverty, because a lot of
yep,
people living on the land don't have security on the land.
right,
So they could
because
grow
of
the
course,
crops and then be kicked off the land
yep,
and the crops taken away from them.
yep,
So it's not in their best interest to invest heavily
mhm.
in the best farming techniques and equipment and things like this because they don't have security to the land.
But
Um,
the USA situation does speak to the goal of the UN of correcting and preventing trade restrictions and distortions in the agricultural markets. So that is their goal,
yes,
to stop these distortions where you can pay farmers to not grow on fields, not as in the health of the ground, so we're rotating, but actually to just let land go to waste, so to speak, go fallow, as you said. Um, Instead of doing something like, how about taking that land and allowing another farmer to grow a different product? Like, how about doing it differently? How about organizing ourselves in different ways to ensure that land rests, but also um, people have jobs, people can grow food. Like, there is a different way of looking at that problem that you have and correcting and preventing those problems, which is what the UN are talking about.
yeah. So I'm mindful of the time here.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm looking at we've gone over an hour. I just want to raise one other point, um, and that is that we look at industrial methods,
Mhm,
um, and we assume that that is the way to go
mhm,
because it seems efficient.
mhm,
But actually, I was reading an article. I have it saved somewhere. Um, when I came across it when I was doing the research for this
mhm,
uh, in one of the journals I was reading, and what they said was actually that the traditional farming methods in
mm,
good years
mhm,
produce equally
mhm.
to agricultural methods, right?
I'll say that louder for people in the back who look down on the traditional methods of growing and find the people to be. Oh, anyway, continue. Sorry, I'm not.
Right. What else they found was, though,
Mhm,
that in periods of drought and
mhm,
sustained hardship,
mhm.
they actually produced more. They found that the crops that they were growing, the plants that they were growing, were more hardy and resilient than industrially grown crops. So when you're talking about countries in which food insecurity is high, some Asian countries, some African countries, and you want to bring industrialized crops to those areas and regions, and industrialized farming methods, actually, that could actually potentially be counterproductive,
Making their own systems more efficient, empowering their own system.
right? So I just want to bear that in mind. Not everything it's about going into some of these other countries and dealing with, or saying you need to modernize, you need to industrialize. Actually, there's a study that's been, I think the study had been going on for 20 or 30 years,
Mhm.
looking at how the crops were being produced over this period. That says actually, no, that's probably not the best way to approach this. Um, and actually, that the traditional methods are actually doing just fine. The problem is that when you have a small plot of land, and especially when you're growing for yourself,
Mhm.
you cannot grow monocrops.
Mm,
So it
mm.
becomes inefficient.
Mhm, mhm,
Different
mhm,
different crops require different nutrients, different treatments, different watering cycles. All
mhm,
of these things play into it.
mhm,
So what an industrial process will do is, I've got a large field, I grow old potatoes, I go out, I water it, I treat it, I fertilize it, all the same.
mhm.
But when you have to grow for yourself and you now need to grow potatoes, tomatoes, well, first of all, you don't grow potatoes and tomatoes in the same ground because of I believe there's a bacteria that grows in the soil that will destroy one or the other. So you don't grow potatoes and tomatoes in the same ground for a couple of years, and then yeah.
Mhm,
So
mhm,
there's different factors that build in that go into to why that system isn't as
mm,
efficient. Part of that is the
mhm,
amount of land that they have, land security, all of
mhm.
these things. But when applied, pound for pound, they actually produce just as well. And in
Yeah.
hard times, they do even better.
And I think that this is why we do the dark side. Really, this final point is really, as you were talking, drove home the point of why we do this show, because mainstream narratives, mainstream ideologies will look down on native, indigenous, so-called developing countries' methodologies and community ideologies and say, oh, but they're inferior to our industrialized standards. And the truth is far different. The truth is far, far different a picture than that is painted in the mainstream media. And I think that's the reason that we continue to pick these difficult topics that somebody who's watching this program may have felt like, what's food poverty? Like, why were they talking about food poverty? People should have less babies, and came up with those narratives and didn't really understand that the world's producing enough food. Poverty is an issue that is systemic, pervasive, and problematic, and entirely fixable. you know.
Well, I think that was part of the point of the game that I was trying to play with you earlier. And
Yeah.
it was to highlight the fact, actually, rich, prosperous countries like the US, um, you know, they look down on countries, like Romania, like Hungary, and they would say those poor Eastern countries, ex-communist countries.
Mm.
But actually, more of their people are being fed than in your own backyard.
Right.
And so you want to look down on these countries
Right.
who are not as wealthy as your country are,
Right.
but they're doing a much better job of feeding their people
Right.
than you are. And
Yeah.
it's, as I said to you, poor people do better with less resources than rich people.
Yeah.
These poorer countries are doing a much better job of their resources, of feeding their people and their populations,
Mm.
than the richer countries.
Yeah.
And you can say, look, the US has a larger population than Romania. Absolutely true. But it don't change the fact that you're paying your farmers to let your fields stand fallow.
Right.
It just comes back to the point, you're just not making use of the resources that you have. If
Right.
that's if food poverty was a question of food scarcity, but it's not.
It's not. Right.
There is plenty of food to go around. You just don't want it to.
Yeah. 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 And yeah, like I said, I think that is the reason what we've said today, and I'm mindful that we're finishing now, but is the reason that we do this program, is to show people that the solutions and answers, the stereotypes, the negative ideologies that you may hold, that you're trying to unpack, that you might be saying, okay, I'm going to try and unpack this ideology. I don't want to be perceived as racist or capitalist or whatever ideology it is you think. The impact of that ideology in the world is systemic and pervasive. It's not just as simple as saying, I personally don't want to be labeled as this label. When I live in a system that I need to vote differently, that I need to culturally look at changing, that I need to actively do something to change, so that the realities of people in my own backyard and in countries around the world is not the same tomorrow as it is today, that it improves those realities. The idea that so-called Western countries get to look down on other countries as inferior when statistically they are doing worse in metrics like poverty, in metrics like food insecurity, than the nations that they look down on, for me, is a reason that we do the dark side, is to shine a light on that hypocrisy, blatant lie. Because if we can find access to that information, governments have, ministers have access to that information, right? These are journals that are published. These are reports that have been done over decades. This is stuff that, campaigners have been talking about for years. You have access. You are choosing to do something detrimental by perpetuating these ideologies that keep people in poverty. It just isn't. We at the dark side don't stand for that. We stand for educating you differently. I don't know what else to say. That's what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just gonna finish with this one quote from an article, and it's the conclusion of the article. I will tell you what the article is. Right, it's the one. We already grow enough food for 10 billion people and still can't end hunger. Mm-hmm. And the conclusion by this article, or of this paper, because it's in a journal, is: can conventional agriculture provide the yields we need to feed 10 billion people by 2050? Given climate change, the answer is an unsustainable maybe. The more important question is, at what social and environmental cost? To end hunger, we must end poverty and inequality. For this challenge, agroecological approaches and structural reforms that ensure that resource-poor farmers have the land and resources they need for sustainable livelihoods are the best way forward.
Well, I think that is the final word on the subject. Thank you very much for giving that to us. We on the dark side will join you next week. I want to thank Mr. Storm for doing a subject that I've been harping on about now for weeks, saying that I wanted to do, maybe months even, for giving the full attention, respect, and his usual level of research to the subject. So thank you very much. It's really been enlightening for me, and I hope for all of you who have been listening. And I hope that you're beginning to see the differences in how to approach things, and also the techniques that we use. You hear a lot of the technique behind that. So I really do hope that you're learning, and that we're growing, and that we are developing the dark side, the ideology of the alternative. Like we need to do that as a world. So we will see you next week, 9 p.m. Central European time, and after that, whenever you watch it, because you watch on replay, and we appreciate you and we love you for it. Is there anything you want to say in closing, or to say goodbye, basically?
Yeah, subscribe, hit the like button, all of that.
Do the things. Thank you very much. Okay, take care. God bless. Good night.